Today we're going to get to the bottom of the Defund the Police movement and what it actually means. We'll talk about Fox News' favorite new fever dream, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, and my interview with Congressman and former Democratic presidential candidate Eric Swalwell, where we talk about what Congress is doing right now to ensure that Americans can exercise their right to vote, especially after yet another disastrous election in the state of Georgia, and the possibility that Trump doesn't concede the race if he were to lose the election. This is Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. I want to start by talking about defund the police because obviously with a phrase like defund the police, it is ripe for exploitation by right-wing media. So let me just say this first and foremost. The goal of defund the police is not to eliminate the police. That's an absurdist take. The actual goal of defunding the police is just to reduce the glut of funding to police departments and instead fund social services that have been completely gutted. Social services that would take care of mental health and homelessness and addiction. All of which, by the way, have become criminalized since they've become the responsibility of the police. And it's a vicious cycle. The more those programs are defunded, the more that unqualified cops are forced to deal with them. And the more those unqualified cops deal with them, the more those problems, which are left uncared for, are exacerbated, right? Reallocating funding away from police officers doesn't mean anarchy in America or that the inmates are going to take over the asylum or whatever other Fox News hellscape we're being fed. It just means that police can focus on criminal issues and those who are actually qualified to respond to issues of addiction and homelessness and mental health can do so that people can actually get the care they need instead of being deemed criminals or just being killed. So if we're being honest about this, if we're having a good faith discussion about this, then it's clear this would be a win-win. All this is spending our money efficiently. Since when is eliminating wasteful spending not a Republican value, right? If you're a Republican arguing against a more reasonable allocation of your hard-earned tax dollars, then you've lost the plot. So instead of firing up the old conservative media outrage machine and screeching about how the leftists want anarchy to reign, maybe just acknowledge that the system needs some reform. Most of the country already has. And keep in mind, we're not reinventing the wheel here. Where our tax dollars go has always been a reflection of our values. So in this case, when we say defund the police, it's just because funding them at the rate that they're currently being funded doesn't represent our values, which, according to the GOP, makes us anarchists. But when Republicans push to defund everything they want to defund, and I mean education and Medicare and Medicaid and the ACA and Meals on Wheels and food stamps and infrastructure and literally everything except the military, well, that's totally fine. No one gives Republicans shit for taking funding away from our nation's children who need a good education. No one gives Republicans shit for taking meals away from low-income seniors, right? Somehow these are totally fine, but when we watch black people getting killed one day after the next by reckless police officers whose budgets swallow up 40, 50, 60% of our tax dollars, well, then suddenly we're out of control. And that's the thing we have to remember, that funding comes from our tax dollars. And we fund and also defund based on our collective values as a city or a state or even a nation. And right now, the level of funding that police enjoy is just not matching up to our value set. So, I mean, look, it's one thing to spend the vast majority of our tax dollars on the police at the expense of education and healthcare and the arts and community investment, right? That's bad enough on its own. But to do so for a police force that may kill you, that may beat people or slash tires or steal bikes or any of the other things, criminal things that we've seen over the last few weeks, is just insane. This isn't me saying that as a Democrat. This is just human nature. Do you want to hand 50% of your tax dollars from your hard-earned paycheck over to someone who's going to beat the shit out of you? And I say that because we've seen it. We've seen the videos. And by the way, this is coming from someone who's lucky enough to actually trust the police my entire life. I've lived every day of my life knowing that if I called the police, I'd be safe. I'm a hell of a lot luckier than some people out there. But after what I saw the last couple of weeks, they had to work to lose my trust, and they did. They had to show me that they view themselves as above the law. And I know it's not all police officers, obviously. I have people who I love like family who are police officers, but it's certainly some. It's certainly a number that I'm not comfortable with. 59% of Americans are in favor of the protest because we've seen over the last few weeks firsthand proof of this police brutality. That's what blows my mind. This was a protest born out of accusations of police brutality. And the fact that they couldn't manage to pull it together when the whole world was watching them is just the proof you need. They couldn't help but validate every single accusation and then some. You know how when Harvey Weinstein or Bill Cosby went into court, they were suddenly old and feeble, right? Cosby suddenly went blind. Weinstein forgot how to walk. And the hope was obviously to create optics that foster a sense of pity. But what police around the country did when it was their turn to show the country that they weren't as bad as they were being made out to be, it was as if Bill Cosby walked into the courtroom, dropped a pill into a drink, and tried to hand it to the judge. It's like if Harvey Weinstein asked the judge if she wanted to be in movies and then told her to do a little spin. That's how arrogant they were. I mean, it's crazy. This was their chance, with the attention of the whole nation on them, to defend themselves, to be on their best behavior. And all we got was video after video after video from New York to DC to Chicago to Texas of police beating the shit out of people. Essential workers, medics, for the crime of walking down the street, the crime of going home. I mean, they blew it, right? So when you wonder why efforts to reform policing in the United States are gaining so much traction so fast, blame them. It was their opportunity to show that they could live up to the moment, and they failed. And the whole world saw it. The whole world watched a 75-year-old man from Buffalo get shoved to the ground and smash his head on the cement and bleed out of his ears while the cops who did it walked away. The whole world watched a protester on his knees get kicked in the chest by a cop walking by. The whole world watched Rayshard Brooks get shot to death for sleeping in a fucking Wendy's parking lot. And I'm not saying that all police officers are at fault, not by a long shot, but it was enough. It was enough. And so now we're seeing some of these calls for reforms come to bear. In San Francisco, the police will no longer respond to non-criminal calls, and that includes matters involving mental health, the homeless, school discipline, and neighbor disputes. And by the way, that's similar to programs that already exist. According to the LA Times, there's the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, where a medic and a mental health crisis manager respond to emergency calls for help with individuals suffering from severe mental illness, addiction, and homelessness. The San Francisco Department of Human Resources will audit hiring and promotional exams by the police department, and they'll incorporate testing for bias and potential for abuse of force. San Francisco's mayor has directed the police department to establish an explicit policy to ban the use of military-grade weapons against unarmed civilians. Again, if you told me 2 years ago that conservatives would be the ones pushing back against police reforms, when those reforms are to not use military-grade weapons against unarmed civilians, you could have knocked me over with a gust of wind. This is a party that clings to the Second Amendment like it'll disappear if they don't mention it every hour. Now suddenly they're trying to maintain a system where military-grade weapons can be used against unarmed civilians? Isn't that the whole point of the Second Amendment? That a well-regulated militia, necessary to the security of a free state, affords us the right to keep and bear arms, so that when the conservative rapture finally comes to fruition and a tyrannical government moves in to take over, that we the people can defend ourselves? And so now, when a tyrannical government has moved in, when our law enforcement is armed like SEAL Team 6, suddenly we have Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity defending not the people, but the police. So much for these populists on Fox News, huh? Now maybe you'll understand when I say that conservatism doesn't actually stand for anything that they pretend to stand for. And I want to finish off this segment talking about one more thing, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or the CHAZ in Seattle. And I'm sure you've heard about it from conservative media. If not, listen to how Fox News has branded the CHAZ.
Anarchists, militants, Marxists, whatever you want to call them, have looted, vandalized, and barricaded 6 city blocks of Seattle. And there are already reports of local businesses being extorted. Well, it sounds like a post-apocalyptic hellscape, doesn't it?
Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the latest addition to the global family of nations, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, formerly known as downtown Seattle. The people of Chaz don't have a lot of options for economic development, so they've gone with extortion through violence. Again, just like the conquistadors. There are questions, though, unresolved. For example, what will happen to the American citizens who may have been shopping downtown in Seattle and are now stuck behind the border of Chaz? Can we repatriate them? Are they now prisoners of war?
I mean, is this not a Fox News fever dream? We might not even have to hear about migrant caravans this election cycle, depending on how much mileage Fox News can get out of this. But of course, even though Fox News was handed their dream story, Democrats ousting a police force and taking over a city, right? The story they've been waiting for since Tucker Carlson's bow tie days. They somehow managed to blow it already. Because Fox News decided that the images they'd plaster all over their website, one with a big scary Antifa dude with an assault rifle standing in front of shattered glass, and another with buildings engulfed in flames, would all be fake. The Antifa dude was actually photoshopped into the photo, and the buildings on fire purporting to be Seattle weren't so much Seattle as they were St. Paul, Minnesota. Here's the thing. Without even seeing what's actually happening in the Chaz, you know it's not bad? Because if it was, Fox News wouldn't need to cook up fake photos of it. That's how you know. If the closest thing Fox can get to a damning picture of the Chaz is a burning building in Minnesota, then guess what? The Chaz probably isn't too bad. But just for good measure, you want to know what actually happens inside the leftist hellscape of anarchy and terror that is the Chaz? Among other things, there are movies in the streets, voluntary night watch signups, medical tents, food, speeches by various speakers, including representatives of the police. There are murals and street art, music, marching. I've seen footage of all of this. You don't have to take my word for it. Go look up footage of the Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. Anything beyond the still frame that Fox News is pumping out with the same scary Antifa soldier photoshopped into every picture. Go look at actual footage, moving pictures, and see for yourself. The reason you won't see it on Fox is because anything beyond their 3 manipulated photos would undermine the talking point that radical leftists have taken over and are forcing everyone to drink lattes and listen to rap and get healthcare or whatever other horrific ideas emerge from the left. With that all said, I don't want the point here to get lost amid all the Fox News bullshit, because I think that's their goal, right? Their goal is to make us forget about the root of these protests and instead focus on the minutia. To argue about one city block in Seattle and Antifa soldiers and whatever else they can cook up. Even arguing about their own doctored images is achieving their goal of deflecting from the root of the problem here. And that's because they know that the root of the problem, the issue of systemic racism and police brutality and a refusal to acknowledge the humanity of Black Americans, is a real and valid issue that the American people overwhelmingly agree needs reform, and that Fox News and Republicans stand against because they'd rather blindly demonize the left than acknowledge that change is needed to make this country better. And that's why Fox News and conservative media is so dangerous, because they'd rather cater to their own political interests than the actual interests of the American people. Something to remember when you're deciding which party to punch your ballot for in the next election. That's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next week. You've been listening to No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, produced by Sam Graber, music by Wellesley, and recorded in Los Angeles, California. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on your preferred podcast app and check out briantylercohen.com for links to all of my other channels.